it didn't seem like the justices were able to come up with a coherent sort of remedy. And meanwhile, even the states, the Democratic states that were, suing against this birthright citizenship policy, also agreed that, there are some issues with nationwide injunctions.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle, and I'm joined today by legal reporter Kaelan Deese. Kaelan, injunction, what's your function? So President Trump has had a lot of battles with the lower courts, trying to block some of his actions. We've started to hear some of what the Supreme Court thinks about this issue. The justices had been a little bit reluctant to weigh in on this before, but now they're hearing some arguments. Walk us through a little bit why this has come before the Supreme Court now and where things stand.
Thank you so much. So basically where this stands is, for the longest time, nationwide injunctions have been in many ways a bipartisan complaint among presidential administrations. It just seems like that as years go on and each passing presidency goes by, there seems to be a trend where more of a president's policies are being stopped in lower courts by these lower court federal judges that say, we're going to pause this naturally.
And so groups often that oppose what a given president is doing will sue, and in some cases they will pick jurisdictions that they think are likely to rule in their favor, and then these lower court judges block the president's policy for the whole country while this is being litigated.
Right, and a lot of times critics will call that, judge shopping, forum shopping. It gets into the weeds of a little bit of whether or not it is, but it does exist, and both sides of the political spectrum engage in it. So that's really kind of what brings us here today to this issue. We had at least 3 lower courts block the birthright citizenship order, which was to essentially say if both of your parents aren't from the U.S. and you're born on U.S. soil, we're going to claw back your citizenship. And that was a very controversial issue, but it was something that Trump was very adamant about because he would complain about things like, the term anchor babies, where people from overseas would come over. So that is kind of, where this stems from.
His objection to it is an illegal immigration-based objection, and the argument that the administration's making is that birthright citizenship as envisioned in the 14th Amendment wasn't originally intended to apply to the children of illegal immigrants. At least that's their argument. Precisely.
So getting into this point now where we are appealing these lower court orders, the government is appealing these lower court orders, they wanted to rush this issue to the Supreme Court very fast because they saw it as a pattern of lower courts just simply not even actually having trials on the merits of the birthright order, just completely blocking it before that even gets implemented at all. So the administration saw that as unfair to their agenda. So basically, the issue that was at hand before the Supreme Court is there something that can be done to regulate or remedy this epidemic of nationwide injunctions that the Trump administration has been talking about? And to those who are sympathetic to the administration, I would say there is data to show that there's been around 40 nationwide injunctions against this Trump administration just in the second term since January. So a lot of people are looking at this and in some justifiable way, they're saying, well, all the things that we voted for are not necessarily being implemented. And that seems to be what Trump himself is saying. He came out on Truth Social today saying, he was talking more about birthright, his order getting, passed and implemented. But the actual nationwide injunction issue is where I think the justices were taking pause, because there's been several members of the court, Justice Thomas, Justice Gorsuch, who have said before that they think that this is something that needs to be addressed. And whether it's telling lower courts to do this in more rare circumstances, whether it's actually precluding them from the top court giving a sort of edict down to the lower courts, that seemed to be where the uncertainty started to, boil down to today. It didn't seem like the justices were able to come up with a coherent sort of remedy. And meanwhile, even the states, the Democratic states that were, suing against this birthright citizenship policy, also agreed that there are some issues with nationwide injunctions because even President Joe Biden suffered a few whenever he was, back. I mean, like for one, like he wasn't really able to ever accomplish his agenda when it came to promising student loans
debt
and
relief
things like that.
things
Yeah,
like that, right.
So yeah, I mean, it is more of a bipartisan issue than people think, but because Trump is in office, obviously more of the complaints are coming from the right. So the question now is what is going to happen whenever they finally rule on this issue. I was talking to some experts on this just earlier today. One of them being South Texas College of Law professor Josh Blackman. He had a interesting prediction. He said that if the Supreme Court wanted to solve this issue, they could have done it a long time ago, and they still haven't. And is this going to be the issue today, this case, where they actually remedy it? It's kind of an open question. So rather than focusing maybe on whether or not we're going to stall lower courts from implementing nationwide injunctions, maybe it's going to turn to rather, are we just going to tee this up for actual oral arguments on whether Trump's order violates the 14th Amendment?
The birthright citizenship.
Yeah, and the birthright citizenship case. So, I mean, that could, we could basically be seeing actual merits arguments on this as early as the fall if the Supreme Court wanted to. It seemed like Chief Justice John Roberts was getting at that point today whenever he was asking some of the parties, if this is something that, you think that we could do expeditiously. Both of the parties, the government and the suing plaintiffs, seem to agree that they could do this in a more expeditious manner on the actual merits of the case. Does this violate the 14th Amendment or not? And that seems to be maybe one of the off-ramps that the justices could take. But the alternative route would be much more interesting, is do they tell lower courts in some sort of, maybe it's some sort of, like binding or advisory way, whether they should be tamping down their reliance on nationwide injunctions.
Thank you, Kaelan. You can read Kaelan and the rest of our investigation team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.